There was a moment during my time with Clair Obscur Expedition 33 where I thought to myself, I'm ready for this to be over now. This is not an unusual sentiment for me to have with games, especially those that have a self-directed finitude. You know the deal, there's a point of no return, often signposted with all the subtlety and nuance of a carnival ride, and you are tasked with making the choice as to when you cross that threshold. The thing is, I've always found that freedom deflating. Momentum lost to the winds of expansion, that destination on the horizon increasingly less inviting, and in the worst cases, an experience gets shelved indefinitely right before the finish line. It's part of the reason why my relationship with role-playing games in particular has waned over the years. It's why I find myself increasingly not that fussed about upturning every stone in these games, instead pushing myself to seek a disciplined engagement with what that final push would be like without those experiential accoutrements. The allure of more, however, is hard to resist, and with alarming frequency as I found myself cresting the wave of the journey and in preparation to be washed back to shore, I am ever united with that same thought. I'm ready for this to be over now. With Expedition 33, however, this utterance came as a bit of a surprise. Up until that point, I was having an absolute blast with the game, an experience that rocketed me along from plot point to plot point, lavishing me with potent moments of character drama, brilliantly kinetic combat encounters, gorgeous environments to explore, and, of course, Lorien Testard's stunning eclectic soundtrack. My initial impression of Clair Obscur was like that of many others. This is brilliant, without hyperbole, the real deal, the final fantasy killer, the new gold standard by which all future role-playing games need to be held to task, a lesson in passion, a love letter to creativity. The game is all those things everyone says it is, and more. While the rose tint of recency bias has started to quietly wear off, and I think a lot of folk need to have a word with themselves about how they lionize creative works in such a combative manner, it's inarguable that Expedition 33 is special. It hits almost every target it aims for: striking art direction, a compelling story that is steeped in cultural identity and, miraculously, nails the landing, a memorable cast brought to life by some astonishing voice acting, and a grotesquely engaging combat system that doesn't simply rest on the laurels of its unique selling point. It's no bloody wonder it's been decimating awards ceremonies. People love it, and I think I love it too. And yet, as the hours ticked on, I found myself with a question lingering at the back of my mind. If this game really is the bee's knees, why did that thought slip into view? I'm ready for this to be over now. Was it the meandering, directionless scope of the endgame? The ramp-up in difficulty of combat encounters in these vast, suffocating optional dungeons? Or was it a nagging doubt that the game was tricking me into staying here, and that all of this was proving a point that the narrative has been desperately trying to tell me this whole time? Was the ultimate goal of Expedition 33 to teach us that sometimes you can have too much of a good thing? Following a setting of the stakes, imbuing a grounded sense of peril and dotting the journey with morsels of mystery, drama and tragedy, Clair Obscur's third act is, like many of the games that inspired it, a drastic alteration of the state of play, a whirlwind of expository bombshells that fundamentally change the direction of the game's narrative, a driving force for the final sequence wherein the world map opens up enormously and you are left with a final, solitary objective: to return to the fractured city of Lumiere and to take to task the true face of your existential threat. Up until this point, your journey to reach the paintress and halt the doomsday clock that had come to define your entire being was a funneled pilgrimage in an expansive world, gently but firmly guiding you along a path that would end at the foot of the monolith. and that last impossible task to undertake. Those early hours do give the player a little wiggle room to get out and explore, a landscape dotted with optional areas. However, what's interesting about these spaces is that many of them deliver a stern warning and a feeling like you are not meant to be there yet. There's an argument to be made that this sense of danger, and subsequently the defining catalyst for the game's brisk pace, stems from how its combat system works. All throughout your travels, you are faced with dangerous enemies who truly test your resolve. I lost fights countless times during my journey. Of course, those formidable boss encounters required a score of redos from time to time, but also regular enemies prowling the field and dungeons brought the thunder to my door. Thanks to the punishingly hubristic nature of the game's dodge parry system, where a greater reward was offered for surrendering yourself to a much tighter and thus riskier reaction window, much of that pain was something I had inflicted on myself. But even implementing every trick in the playbook, dodging, parrying, implementing strategic use of character abilities, and the seemingly infinite malleability of the Pictos system, in any encounter I faced, there was a sense that these were challenges I could not simply grind my way out of. As a result, though, throughout these moments of ego-deflating defeat and a miraculous triumph, there was a profound sense of hope. Each fight felt more manageable than the last. I began to better understand my environment and in turn what I and my team were capable of when we work together. Like the plucky underdogs that make up the game's cast, my resolve never waned. I was immersed in that world, that plight, that fire to keep pushing forward. However, once Act 3 rolls around and you are given the freedom to explore those peripheral areas previously held at arm's length, the game seems to take on an entirely different set of priorities, ones that at first feel counter to the message that Clair Obscur appeared to be delivering. The journey transforms itself into a contest of strength, dexterity, and strategic prowess. Gone is the sense of urgency, in its place a more placid, liminal, and ill-defined concept of preparation. Which is interesting, because in the right pair of hands, such a daunting idea works extremely well. I spoke about this a lot in my video on Breath of the Wild, where building a game around one final confrontation gives the player a freedom to engage with the experience at their own discretion, where ambiguity over what is needed for that final push drives people to seek out the moments that end up defining the experience for them. The narrative lead into Clair Obscur's Act 3 supports this idea, or at least it seems to at first. Extracted from a hostile space following an encounter with Renoir, the game's alleged big bad, your party seeks to revisit old haunts in order to build an army of the dead, grave robbing in nicer terms and with a deliciously harmonious reflection on that ever-potent narrative through line, when one falls, we continue. That's not what you, the player, actually do though. All your prep work is done for you in this carefully curated montage, meaning that by the time the reins are handed back over, all you need to do is set down at that final location and push on. While initially deflated by this, on reflection I think this was the right choice, as it means that instead of getting gummed up revisiting old areas for what would be, mechanically, a series of dull fetch quests, you can, should you choose, maintain that very same pace that has been rocketing you along all this time, a way open to the denouement for you to choose when to step towards, a lesson well learned from the games that came before. Except, there's this whole world out there, a space ripe with invitation. What about all those ancillary locations earmarked with the threat of danger you were too nervous to venture into before? What about the towering dungeons and floating islands and that big worm-like creature hovering menacingly not that far off in the horizon? What's up with that? What about yourselves? There are abilities still to unlock. Your weapons, are they strong enough? Have you learned enough to be able to face that final unknown challenge? Venturing out into these newly accessible spaces, the answer seems to be a firm no. There is a significant ramp-up in difficulty to be found here. All of a sudden, everyone in my party became a glass cannon. As attacks came fast and hard, my own dexterity and tactical knowledge put to task in a fundamentally grueling way. It became an ordeal even to understand in what order it made sense to tackle many of this world's points of interest, as some areas played host to creatures so potent I couldn't even tank a single hit. I resorted to a guide quite quickly, but even this gave me little respite. I simply had to make peace with the work that lay ahead. a war of attrition wholly appropriate for the tone of the narrative of the game, but one that started to sap my enthusiasm piece by piece. This is what always seemed to happen with JRPGs for me, a death by 1,000 cuts. The funnel opens into an inviting buckshot of side quests, hidden story beats, and optional dungeons. You suddenly find yourself tasked with fully understanding the underlying systems in order to best the harshest challenges these games have to offer, and it's almost always a distraction from that final threat on the horizon. Clair Obscur is, before anything else, a deeply loving homage to an era of artistic endeavour, one found within this very specific subgenre of games. It's not just cribbing from Final Fantasy, you see the spirits of many franchises within. Very much a love letter to the PS2 era in my eyes, the game perfectly understands the assignment. It knows what players want from this particular type of game, because it's those same players who made the game. As such, it's hard to fault Sandfall for giving such a rich, generous amount of optional things to do right at the end. It's what we expect, it is what is desired. And the things on offer are, in themselves, exciting, narratively satisfying, and a lot of fun to dive into. But they are also a roadblock. A playground of ideas so voluminous that the oversaturation led me eventually to make the decision to be at peace with what I had engaged with and what I had not. However, it was only once I finally crossed the threshold, tackled the final challenge, and found myself in stunned silence at the tapering end of a credits roll that I stopped thinking of this experience as a black mark on an otherwise enjoyable adventure, and started to wonder if there was some creative intent behind the fostering of that emergent emotion. In writing this essay, I have desperately been trying to avoid talking about the actual narrative beats of Clair Obscur. As much as I found them engaging and often heart-wrenching, they are not the thing that interests me about this game, nor do I want to fall into the trap of transforming this piece of analysis into a plot summary. However, to talk about why I think my exasperation with Clair Obscur's final act is a brilliant piece of perhaps accidental diegetic design, you need to know what my particular understanding of the game, the story, and the world are all building towards. It starts with that shock revelation at the opening of Act 3, that everything you have experienced up until this point has been a fiction, brushstrokes upon a supernatural canvas, echoing the lingering fragments of the soul of a man who has been dead for quite some time. What you seek here in averting the apocalypse is a resolution to a seemingly century-long conflict between a succession of gods who are, in reality, a family caught in a violent cycle of grief. Loss permeates all aspects of the game. A fractured howl of anguish found in the setting, in the interactions of the cast, and in a very potent way it is the conflict that lies at the heart of the game's final act. Post-revelation, you open your eyes once more, your head ripe with even more questions, and a desire to relitigate the answers you already sought. That tactical retreat is very much designed to justify giving the player freedom to explore, develop, and give yourself a fighting chance in that daunting final encounter, bolstering your survivability should you not possess the cat-like grace needed to engage in a purely skill-based clash of blades. But it is also an opportunity to explore the backdrop to all this chaos now the veil has been lifted. To navigate the more existential components of this newly stirred elucidation, and to interrogate those ancillary narrative threads that build upon this central strife. In doing so, you learn more about the grief of the Descendre family, this central catalyst for everything that has happened and will happen. You get a better picture of the world they were fighting over, and in turn you experience a deeply unsettling philosophical quandary as characters who don't really exist contend with the fact that they are, nonetheless, conscious, sapient beings. This all manifests in-game as a volumetric shit-ton of dungeons to navigate, beautifully animated regions to explore, a score of new paradigm-shifting pictos to unlock, and disarmingly difficult boss fights to chuck yourself against. Sandfall were incredibly generous in what they offered the players here. It was in that generosity, however, that I found myself sinking into habits as old as time, greedily exploring every inch of the map, not just in search of the conclusions to the game's tight circle of side quests, ones that are essential to bringing some semblance of closure to each character's narrative arc, but also in seeking weapons to attack and dethrone God, a process I undertook fully conscious of the fact that it would impact the tension and challenge of those final encounters. Regardless, I wanted to see what cool shit lay in wait for me in all those corners of Expedition 33's painted world. I wanted to allay that nagging stain of FOMO that was seemingly offered up to me on a silver platter. This is how it goes with RPGs. The final boss is never the hardest fight in the game anyway, treated more like a victory lap than anything else. There's always something more sinister lurking in the darkest depths of the most dangerous areas for the real sickos to contend with. You optimize the grind, seeking out those all too familiar loops that had ensnared us all in almost every other role-playing game encountered since childhood. To be overpowered is to know the game inside out, to look death in the eyes and say, "Not this time, bozo." Framed a certain way, Expedition 33 rewards this by offering challenges that are narratively relevant, breathing additional life into a story that is already rich with context and nuance. Your innate desire to shirk your responsibilities and explore the world are rewarded heartily. These narrative encounters aren't essential, however, and, as it turns out, neither were they particularly relevant to my relationship with this tale's conclusion. The more time I spent trying desperately to ignore the looming presence of Lumiere's crooked tower on the horizon, itself a conscious companion to the ever-present monolith that your expedition had been fighting towards for most of the game, the more I found myself getting frustrated. I was caught up in the weeds of these increasingly challenging fights, choice paralysis brought on by a web-like catalogue of new places to see, new obsessions to grip me tight and prevent me from understanding what's really going on here. I found a great spot to grind out levels and upgrade materials, itself a fun nod to the massacre that opens Expedition 33's first steps into the new world, demonstrating just how far you have come. I stayed there for way longer than I needed to. And then, something clicked. This is why this place is so dangerous. This is the game telling me how easy it is to get caught up in flights of fancy, to the detriment of something more painful, sure, but ultimately more real. It was only once I made that decision and in turn experienced the conclusion to this fable that I properly understood what it was that Clair Obscur was actually trying to say. Right at the end of the game, you were presented with a choice between two paths, both of which result in the same final encounter, only from different perspectives. The choice is not easy as it is presented to you in the moment. It preys on the relationship you have built with these characters over the previous 30 to 60 hours. It puts you in a place between two forms of annihilation, warring states that explicitly cannot coexist. Either this world needs to end, or those who reside within remain trapped in stasis, a fractured facsimile of living predicated on the whims of yet another god. For me, the choice was simple. I saw firsthand what this place was doing to the people within it. I felt it in my own joy and enthusiasm sapping the more time I spent enveloping myself in that world. I started to see how difficult it was for me to realize when enjoyment turned into compulsion. I was ready to do what I considered to be the only right thing, a route to suffering's end, one way or another. And as a result, there was so much of Clair Obscur that I never got round to seeing or achieving. I caught glimpses of a dozen hidden areas ripe with puzzles to solve and formidable foes to conquer, left instead without resolution. As much as I dived into the narrative accoutrement, bolstering my understanding of each party's motivations, so too did I leave threads frayed and untethered. Part of why this final push to see the story's conclusion was such a struggle was that I found so much to convince me to stay, and yet, when I finally made the decision to tackle that one last fight, I found myself without an ounce of regret. Clair Obscur's story is told extremely well, but more skilled to me is how this emergent diegetic engagement with the ludic text of the game allowed me to see its primary struggle in a completely different light. it made me realise what all of this was building up to. How a celebration of the life and artistry of a young man whose life had been cut short had been poisoned into an undying mausoleum of regret. That the end of the world wasn't some act of cruelty from an uncaring God, but instead a loving father's desperate plea for salvation, and a grieving mother's determination to ward off the apocalypse as long as possible. And with this in mind, no matter your choice at the game's conclusion, there doesn't seem to be a good ending after all. The loss has already been calculated. The grief remains eternal. All good art holds a mirror to mankind, but sometimes it's hard to see the reflection for the brushstrokes. And even more than this, an artist doesn't always know exactly what it is they've created. For all my calculated talk about diegetic intentionality, I don't actually think this was what the game's creators envisioned the experience of Clair Obscur to culminate in. In an interview with Edge magazine, some of the developers at Sandfall talked about the conventions of the PS1 era of JRPGs, the primary source of inspiration for Expedition 33, and how giving the player a choice with how they wanted to conclude the story was of paramount importance, a direct means of controlling the narrative, and the freedom to extend the lifespan of the game by their own hand. Some members of the team had expressed a form of regret about how they handled the signposting regarding what that choice would do to your experience, as well as a latent anxiety about respecting the player's time and willingness to take a chance on their game. Interestingly though, not one of the interview transcripts I read while writing this could I find any discussion of the connection between the gameplay and everything else, nor any parallels to my own conflicted encounter with the choice to stay away from the finish line. A lot of talk about the harmonizing of those disparate parts of the creative process, for sure. It's clear from these interviews how much of Clair Obscur's design process was a meeting of minds, ideas bouncing off ideas in ways that elevated the coherent whole to a higher plane of existence. And yet, for a game billed as a love letter to an entire genre, that specific omission from the formula, the gameplay itself, feels weird. Part of this is likely due to the wide range of backgrounds of the developers. Although the JRPG staples are all in there in droves, many of the team at Sandfall came from backgrounds other than games, inspired as much by prestige TV, literature, and even shows like Cirque du Soleil as they were by the scrappy adventures of Cloud Strife et al. It's clear as day what benefit that brings to the project, but it does also make me wonder if ludonarrative harmony is something that matters more to people like me than it does to the folk who actually make games. And more importantly, if this kind of emotional resonance does end up being a happy accident, is that unintentionality the thing that makes the experience special? That's the element to all this that I feel goes under-discussed when talking about creative outputs. The fact that people will draw their own conclusions from your work, no matter how confident you feel your guidance might be. Everything I have written thus far is a heavily solipsistic interpretation of events, built from decades of my own life experiences, my tastes in games, and what I look for when reflecting on those ludic encounters. Perhaps the reason I had this very specific synergistic outlook on the game's finale is due to the fact that it was something I was actively seeking. An invocation of an audience's will. A recognition of the inherent symbiosis between creator and player. There's a string of ideas to be reconciled, debated, and expelled, none of which have any grounding in empiricism, all of which have a fundamental impact on the way we read the complete story of Clair Obscur. However, in recognizing both the strengths and weaknesses of the work as a holistic entity, I must be honest about how much importance I hold in one particular understanding, that the story and the game should really be one and the same, because that to me is where Clair Obscur is operating at its best. This game is full of these brilliant moments of ludonarrative harmony, examples of a developer who understood the medium they were working in and thought about how to use it to amplify the story they wanted to tell. It's in the little things, like the bleeding of cutscenes into and throughout combat encounters, the fact that every victory concludes with the immortal words, "We continue," checkpoints being the banner flags of the expeditions that came before you, those crystalline audio logs found along the journey, a technology used by the party themselves, decades of history shown, not told, but also actively participated in. But then you also have the more intimate, narratively significant choices, like how primary protagonist Gustav has a whole skill tree you cannot unlock before he is brutally cut down at the end of the game's first act, a move immeasurable in its cruelty not only because it denies the player a raft of additional combat options for a character in their prime, but that it also plants both a seed of doubt about the permanence of his exit from the story, one that ultimately never germinates, and a thematically resonant additional layer of grief at what could have been. Consider also Maëlle, a character reborn of the guilt-ridden young woman convinced of her own responsibility for the death of her brother at the hands of a violent Blaze, having a moveset that is almost exclusively fire-based, itself an albatross around her neck and a means by which she violently exerts dominion over a world she finally has some degree of control over, something that itself is open to audience interpretation, but an unconscious piece of design that informs your opinion of her stakes in the story. And then you, the player, the one holding the reins who, in spite of their limited direct involvement with this troublesome tale of grief, anger and conflict, with that final encounter, the decision falls on you, to be made based on how your own engagement with the game as a whole has shaped your feelings towards both sides of the conflict, what you have seen in the darkest corners of this world, and how much of yourself you bring into the equation, a reflection on your fundamental relationship with grief, a choice born of pure solipsism. So ingrained in the language of video games, Clair Obscur is, in fact, that when rumours of a cinematic adaptation of the work came out, I met that news with revulsion, not curiosity, contesting it with a simple question that has come to define my relationship with the game in totality. What is this story without the player? That's the question I find myself asking about many works I've engaged with over the years. If a particular creation is born of a specific medium, what is it about that particular project that means it has to be this and this alone? Sadly, the answer for a lot of those experiences is a resounding, I don't know. Much in the way that I will sometimes look at a TV series and think this would be better suited as a feature film, there have been many games I've played that I just don't see justifying their existence as things to be engaged with in this way. That jaw-droppingly boring focus on making interactive experiences cinematic without internalizing what that term would actually mean in the context of player-directed encounters. But Clair Obscur, the moment-to-moment loops of exploration, combat, and the way those things syncopate with the story being told, that's something that elevates the work beyond any constituent part. And I think by removing it, by pulling the canvas back to safety behind a wall of celluloid, something fundamental will get lost in translation. I appreciate that there is a simple counter-argument to this. Ambiguity and audience interpretation is nothing new. In fact, it has been a staple of storytelling for thousands of years. Perspectives lie lavish in the hearts of those who have lived entire lifetimes. Who's the hero? Who's the villain? Those kinds of questions are the bread and butter of good drama, no matter the genre or medium. That kind of immersion doesn't inherently require participation, and therefore an adherence to specific tropes of gaming are not necessarily the secret sauce that makes Clair Obscur what it is. However, it is not the idea of interaction that has driven me to feel this way about the game, but rather the context of what that interaction actually is. Clair Obscur's meta layer. The compulsion to keep playing knowing that it's hurting your experience, a desire to remain even though you know you should move on, that feels perfectly at home within this narrative that is, after everything's said and done, a story about the dangers of hiding from grief. That is Clair Obscur to me. A conflicted journey, one with highs and lows, moments of triumph and pain, and something that directly courts the player to join it in that passage. In that generous connection, it draws such an immense amount of power from the relationship you form with that world, the people within it, and ultimately how you make peace with the knowledge that all journeys must, eventually, come to an end. If there's a lesson to be learned here, it's that the best use of gaming as a medium is not to use the player interaction as a mechanism for delivering a story, but for that interaction to be the story. Exploring the ludic space as a diegetic function of narrative, inviting the player to participate in the artistic intent. And Clair Obscur, for all its charms and for how much I enjoyed my time with it, is a game that I feel could have gone further. It is still a project burdened by genre conventions. It wears its inspirations so heavily on its sleeve that I worry it doesn't realize how many of its own ideas it gets right. The motifs, the world building, the story itself, all weaved effortlessly through the way you engage directly with that space. Sandfall has created something that has really tapped into the zeitgeist for fans of the genre, in turn wholly justifying why, among all the mediums on offer, this had to be a game.